こんにちは、ハリケーンフットボールです。今回の教材は、サッカー日本代表に関する動画です。日本代表は、ワールドカップグループステージ第一節で、オランダと対戦し、死闘の末、2対2で引き分けで終わりました。この動画では、この試合を戦術面から詳しく分析しています。この動画では、特に日本がいかにうまく守備をしており、オランダの一見固そうに見えるディフェンスを、どれだけ緻密に攻撃していたのかを称賛しています。実際にどのように話しているのか、チェックしてみましょう。
Ronald Koeman managed to neutralize Japan's strengths, but the match still ended in a 2-2 draw. Let's break it down. The Netherlands enjoyed more possession throughout the game, and their initial 4-3-3 shape was clearly visible in the opening stages. Frankie de Jong often dropped deeper to receive the ball and acted as one of the main playmakers in this match. Whenever he moved deeper, he looked to find his two central midfield partners between the lines with progressive passes. However, Japan's mid-block was so compact that doing so proved extremely difficult. Early in the game, realizing how hard it was to find space with their initial structure, the Dutch began introducing more rotations. Whenever the ball was played wide, Japan would aggressively shift towards that side and overload the ball zone with numbers. In response, the Netherlands often brought both central midfielders closer to the flank to create local overloads and combine quickly in tight spaces. At times, these combinations worked precisely because of those additional players moving across. Another important aspect was the rotation between the Dutch right back and right winger. Dumfries frequently pushed forward, while Somerville dropped deeper to receive the ball. This movement allowed Somerville to receive comfortably to feet, and with his dribbling ability, he often found himself isolated one-on-one against one of Japan's attacking players rather than a defender. That gave him a clear advantage, and on numerous occasions he managed to knock the ball past his opponent and drive forward. Once he beat his man, the Netherlands immediately created 2-versus-1 situations on the flank. From there, Dumfries was often ready to attack the half space and receive in behind, and Somerville sometimes took matters into his own hands and dribbled into the penalty area. Another aspect worth highlighting was Dumfries' physical profile. When the ball was on the opposite side, having a tall, athletic player in the box provided an extra target for crosses. Compared to Japan's left lateral, Dumfries was expected to dominate at the far post, and several deliveries led to dangerous knockdowns and shots. Still, the key factor was Japan's defensive structure. Japan defended in a 5-3-2 shape, but their center backs were always prepared to step out aggressively and engage opponents higher up the pitch. Their backline played proactively, and the entire team remained extremely compact. Reinders and Gravenberch simply had no chance of receiving in central areas between the lines. The Netherlands circulated possession, but Japan's organization was exceptional. One sequence perfectly demonstrated their discipline. Cody Gakpo made a run in behind, and the right center back, who had initially been monitoring Gravenberch in central areas, was immediately ready to drop deeper and cover the space. Japan switched references brilliantly, constantly protecting dangerous zones and providing cover for teammates. Even when Dutch players managed to receive inside Japan's compact structure, they rarely created anything meaningful. 2 or 3 Japanese players would immediately collapse on the ball carrier from different directions. And even if a pass was somehow played under pressure, Japan would instantly recover towards their own goal and close down the next receiver. There were moments when 4 Japanese players stood in front of the ball carrier, making any further progression impossible. Japan's intensity, compactness, and defensive decision-making were all at an extremely high level. Another important detail was the role of the left wing-back, Nakamura. In the mid-block, Japan's shape often resembled more of a 4-4-2 than a 5-3-2 because Nakamura was willing to step higher and closely track Somerville, preventing him from receiving freely. For example, when Van Dijk gave the ball away, Japan immediately recovered possession and launched a 4-man counterattack. That pattern was characteristic throughout the match. Compact defending, excellent organization, and quick transitions. As for the Netherlands, they defended in a somewhat unusual manner. De Jong played a crucial role out of possession, dropping deeper and helping form a 5-4-1 defensive structure. Speaking about Japan's structure, one of the key aspects of their game was Daichi Kamada. The central midfielder frequently dropped deeper, received the ball without pressure, and from those deeper positions, looked to find progressive options, whether between the lines or in behind. The Netherlands allowed this to happen because they mostly defended in a medium to low block and rarely pressed aggressively. Japan's players were given time to control possession and build attacks. Moving closer to the defensive phase on their own half, I think Ronald Koeman devised an excellent plan against Japan, one that many teams should take note of. Japan overload the space between the lines and usually form a front five. Those five advanced players remain quite vertical and constantly attack depth across all five channels. By moving Frenkie de Jong from midfield into the back line, Koeman effectively solved part of that problem. Each defender became responsible for a specific channel, meaning those forward runs and vertical passes were no longer able to create major danger. In theory, every run into depth should have been tracked. Moreover, when Japanese players received between the lines, the back five allowed one of the center backs to step out aggressively, press the receiver and prevent him from turning, while the rest of the defensive line shifted compactly to cover the vacated space. That's how the system was supposed to function. We can see an example with de Jong, who steps out from the back line and wins possession. However, not everything worked as intended. First, the Dutch players did not always compensate for the spaces properly. Second, even against a back five, Japan still found ways to attack the space behind the defense. Here it's worth highlighting the movement of Japan's striker. In this particular sequence, the forward recognizes the channel left open when one of the defenders steps out. Whenever a player, like de Jong in this example, moved higher to press, the Dutch backline did not always shift compactly enough to cover the exposed area. In this sequence, de Jong follows a Japanese player into central midfield. Virgil van Dijk immediately gestures to his teammates, demanding greater compactness and pointing to the channel behind him that needs to be covered. At the same time, Japan's center forward positions himself between the lines. Once again, there is virtually no pressure on the ball carrier. And that ball carrier is Daichi Kamada, a player with outstanding long-range passing ability. The striker then attacks the space vacated by de Jong after he stepped out. So there were flaws in the Dutch defensive structure as well. De Jong did not always recover into the back five, nor did he consistently track those runs in behind. As a result, Japan created several dangerous situations. Another recurring issue was the lack of compactness, despite playing with five defenders. And the Dutch defenders did not shift compactly enough towards the ball side to compensate for them. Another important detail was that Dutch players often became two-man oriented. Instead of reacting to the situation and passing runners onto teammates, they tended to stick with the same opponent from the beginning to the end of the sequence. In this example, Van Dijk tracks one player and leaves another. The gap between Van Hecke and Van Dijk, which is nearly 18 meters wide, is immediately attacked by a Japanese runner. Once again, the player on the ball has all the time in the world to play a pass in behind. It is actually de Jong who ends up tracking the run rather than Van Dijk, because Van Dijk remains occupied with his own direct opponent. This reluctance to exchange marking responsibilities created even more opportunities for Japan to receive the ball behind the defense. Overall, the Netherlands' covering and support mechanisms inside the box were not always effective either. Here, we see a 2v2 situation on the flank. Van Dijk is initially positioned close to his opponent inside the box. But after a few passes on the wing, the same issue emerges again. First, the channel remains open for a pass into the penalty area, and second, there is a 5-meter gap between Van Dijk and the Japanese attacker. That means he is simply not compact enough and is not in a position to control his opponent effectively. And that's exactly what happens. This time, however, the Japanese player plays a through ball for his teammate. We can even see de Jong instructing Denzel Dumfries to track the run and close the channel. Yet neither Dumfries nor Van Dijk reacts properly. Van Dijk should already be responsible for that player, considering how close he initially was to him. Japan eventually deliver a dangerous low cross, and this sequence can certainly be considered a clear goal-scoring opportunity. Now, let's break down the goals from this match. The opening goal came from a cross into the box, with Virgil van Dijk heading the ball into the corner. However, there is one detail I want to point out. To be fair, I couldn't find a single replay angle from the broadcast that gives a definitive answer. But for some reason, Van Dijk's arm position makes me think that he may have given a slight push to Japan defender Watanabe. Just look at Watanabe's body position in the air. I simply don't believe a defender naturally jumps like that inside the penalty area. Most likely he jumped, felt some contact from behind, and as a result, completely lost control of Van Dijk's movement. It was probably not enough to be considered a foul, since the contact was minimal, but I think that small detail played a key role in the goal. Japan responded quickly. A pass into the channel on the flank created a 1-versus-1 situation near the edge of the penalty area. At first glance, it looked like Japan should not have been able to create anything dangerous from this sequence. 3 Dutch players were positioned around the Japanese attacker and seemed to have everything under control. But Dumfries made the crucial mistake. He took a few steps to his right, towards his own goal, which opened up the passing lane to Nakamura, who was completely unmarked. Dumfries simply failed to deal with the situation. He should have been responsible for blocking that passing lane. Nakamura received the ball, shifted inside with a couple of touches, and curled his shot perfectly into the corner. The Netherlands then scored in a very similar sequence. This time, Somerville drifted inside and also found the far corner with his finish. Finally, the moment that allowed Japan to rescue a draw came from a corner kick. And we can see the key player of this sequence on the screen. The Netherlands defended the corner using a mixed marking scheme. 3 players were positioned zonally around the near post area, while 6 others were assigned man-to-man responsibilities. But as the corner is delivered, we can see that instead of 6 players actively marking their opponents, only 5 are actually doing so. Some execute their assignments better than others. And then there is Mickey van de Ven. What is he doing here? Meanwhile, the player he was supposed to be marking attacks the middle of the box and scores. It is also important to note that Virgil van Dijk was unable to take the necessary step backwards because one of Japan's players effectively blocked him. The combination of those factors ultimately proved decisive in this sequence. Overall, this was a fantastic game from a tactical perspective. There were plenty of interesting individual moments as well, and it was an absolute joy to watch. As for the group standings, the situation is probably developing as expected. Sweden won their match, but now both Japan and the Netherlands find themselves in a much more vulnerable position, especially psychologically, compared to the Swedes. Who do you think will finish top of the group? At this point, I actually believe Sweden will end up winning the group. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for even more World Cup tactical analysis and content.
次は解説です。今回は難しいボキャブラリーはほとんどありませんでしたので、サッカー解説などでよく使われるような表現などを主に解説しています。それでは本日の解説をチェックしてみましょ
う。This movement allowed Somerville to receive comfortably to feet.
Receive to feet はサッカーでよく使われる表現です。選手の足元でパスを受けることを意味します。スペースへ走り込む receive in behind とは反対のイメージです。テクニックのある選手は足元で受けてから展開することが多いです。戦術分析では非常に便利な表現です。足元で受けると覚えるとわかりやすいです。
This movement allowed Somerville to receive comfortably to feet. This movement allowed Somerville to receive comfortably to feet, and Somerville sometimes took matters into his own hands.
Take matters into one's own hands は、ネイティブがよく使うイディオムです。誰かに任せず、自分で行動するという意味です。サッカーでは味方に預けず、自分で仕掛ける場面で使えます。日常会話でもビジネスでも使える便利な表現です。少しドラマチックな響きもあります。自分で何とかすると覚えるとわかりやすいです。
And Somerville sometimes took matters into his own hands. And Somerville sometimes took matters into his own hands, compared to Japan's left lateral.
ラテラウは本来横のという意味です。サッカー戦術ではサイドバックやウィングバックを指すことがあります。特にスペイン語圏の戦術分析でよく見られる表現です。レフトラテラウは左サイドバック、または左ウィングバックの意味です。英語圏の一般的な解説ではレフトバックの方が自然です。 ただし戦術分析動画ではラテラオも出てくるので覚えておくと便利です。
Compared to Japan's left lateral, Japan switched references brilliantly.
スイッチレフラセンスはかなり専門的なサッカー戦術用語です。守備の時に何を基準に対応するかを切り替えるという意味です。例えば、人をマークする守備からスペースを守る守備へ切り替える場面で使われます。また、マークしている相手を味方に受け渡す場面にも使えます。一人の選手だけを追い続けるのではなく、状況に応じて守る対象を変えるイメージです。戦術分析動画ではたまに出てくる上級表現です。
Japan switched references brilliantly. I think Ronald Koeman devised an excellent plan against Japan.
デバイズは考案するという意味の動詞です。ただプランをメイクするよりも工夫して作るニュアンスがあります。戦術、方法、解決策などに対してよく使われます。スマホなどのデバイスと似ていますが、今回のデバイズは動詞であり、発音は最後が図の音になります。中上級者が覚えておきたい便利な単語です。
I think Ronald Koeman devised an excellent plan against Japan. Did not always compensate for the spaces properly.
compensate for space はサッカー戦術で使いやすい表現です。誰かが前に出た時に空いたスペースを別の選手が埋めるという意味です。守備のバランスを保つために非常に重要な考え方です。compensate は日常英語やビジネス英語でも使えます。補う、埋め合わせると覚えると応用しやすいです。
Did not always compensate for the spaces properly.
いかがでしたか？お互いに戦術的にハイレベルな戦いだったことがよくわかるようなものでしたが、オランダの得点に関しては、ファンダイクがうまく渡辺剛の背中を押したこと、サマービルの得点も簡単に触れられる程度であり、日本の得点については、いかにオランダの隙を突き、いかにオランダにズレを生じさせたかを詳細に説明しているなど、かなり日本の方に偏っているような内容でした。さらに、日本が攻撃時にズレを生じさせ、一瞬空いたズレや穴を見逃さずについたのか、いかにオランダの守備がずれたり遅れたりしていたのかを話し、日本の守備時には、いかに守備が規律立っており、ズレや穴を生じさせないように、うまくスペースを埋めたり、うまくマークを受け渡したりしていたのかを解説していました。結果としては、戦術的にハイレベルな試合だったと総括していましたが、この動画を見ると、いかに日本の攻撃も守備も洗練されているのかを実感するようなものでした。チュニジア戦では、オランダ戦とは全く異なる展開になると思いますが、このような緻密な戦術や戦い方がまた見れると思いますので、詳細なプレーも楽しみたいと思います。本日もご視聴いただきありがとうございました。またすぐにお会いしましょう。